upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. I was working for a pizza restaurant, and we had a technician check out our cooler vents because there was a leak, and the floor was uneven. So he asked me to hold the ladder he brought. He fell over when he tried finding the next step down and his leg went in the ladder. He tried to throw the screwdriver so he wouldn't land on it but ended up stabbing me in the left forearm by accident. He had only minor injuries to his knee, and a light smack to his right temple. Afterwards, I grabbed some of the oven tools that were about to be thrown away, put it in the oven and cauterized my wound. I cleaned and bandaged myself up and kept working because the screwdriver only got past my skin. I've also cut my fingers and hands on tomato and onion slicers and knives that my coworkers dumped in the soapy sink. Worked with a retired military vet at a gun holster company. He was a cool guy but one of those all-day poop talkers, always in good fun but could be annoying at times. 3 things to be noted. 1. When you put something on the riveter, you want to make sure your hands and fingers are completely away from the pinch point to avoid pinching your fingers or thumb. 2. When you push down on the pedal with your foot, you just want to push it down, not stomp it. It messes up the rivet and can cause serious damage. 3. If you rivet your fingers, you pull up and off instead of back and off. With that being said, my 3rd day there, I got sidetracked looking at a great booty walking. Wasn't giving the riveter my full attention and pushed down. Took off a good portion of the tip of my thumb, and it hurt really bad. While it was a bloody mess, it wasn't so bad that super glue couldn't fix. Well, the vet gave me poop about it for about a month, teasing and making me the butt of the joke for my negligence. In fairness, it was deservedly so. I was completely at fault, as was my coworker's parents for gifting her with genetics that created her super amazingly gorgeous booty meat. I'm still in love with that butt. Anyways, so about a month later, the vet has to use one of these riveters for one of the products my company makes. When we make stuff, we do it in bulk for either stock, an order for dealers. Well, he rivets together 4 to 5 of said product, stopping it down and not paying attention by talking to one of my co-workers. Out of nowhere you hear "mother lover" from the other side of the building. The vet, in his own negligence, put his stuff on the riveter with his thumb underneath the pinch point. Wasn't paying attention and slammed the pedal to the ground with more force than a seasoned Jedi. The riveter pinched the middle of his thumbnail, cracked the nail straight in half. Blood all over the floor and the riveter. He pulls his hand back and rush off to the bathroom and then eventually to the ER. The vet stomped so hard he fractured his thumb, ripped off half his thumbnail, and when he pulled back he made it worse and caused himself nerve damage. The end result was a mangled thumb that had the top half nail and other half ground beef. Very sickening to see. Not as bad as many of other stories, but still not something you'd want to have happened to your thumb. Plus, the sick guys I work with went to find the other part of the nail with the vet's bloody skin on it and created a necklace of it to give to him. He didn't take it, obviously, and it sat on those guys' desk for about 2 years before we switched shops last year. He's since left, but that story goes around like an urban legend every time a new guy gets hired. It teaches newbies to be completely aware of their digits and maintaining their safety and well-being. Our neighbor worked at a textile factory. He was in charge of mixing different tints in different tanks full of hot water. One time he was measuring the temperature of the water. He bent too much and fell in the tank. He was alone in that department. In the next department, other workers heard screams. They entered the place, but it was too cloudy from the hot water. They took a few minutes to find him. He passed out when they found him, and when they got him out his skin was falling out. The eyelids got stuck together. He died after 2 days in the hospital. His wife kept saying her husband was boiled alive. I can't imagine the pain he must have felt. Used to work for the world's second largest printing company. The plant I worked at was in PA but is now closed. Unrelated to these stores, a maintenance man was working on a 12-foot ladder with a second guy holding at the bottom. The guy on the ladder had low blood sugar and unexpectedly pasted out fell headfirst 10 feet to a concrete floor. The second guy ran for help and then stayed with the first guy. He was unconscious with blood coming out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Everyone feared he was dead, but he recovered with no major problems. My second story is about a guy that was webbing the birdcage, which is when you put the different pages of the magazine in a proper order around steel rollers to form the printed book. All the pages are then feed through steel nip rollers in the floor to go one floor down in the press to the next step in making the book. Well, these steel nip rollers are a pinch point and are always moving while the press is running. The guy wasn't paying attention, stuck his fingers into the nip rollers. On instinct he pulled his hand back as quickly as he could, degloving his hand and part of his forearm. This is when the skin is peeled away from your muscles and bones, like how you would take off a glove, only it's your skin. I'm a truck driver in the oil fields. A guy with the company I work for got hit by a train. Killed him. It was, and still is, an unmarked crossing. I know for a fact that the crossing is dangerous. I've had a few close calls there over the years. I had a wreck January of last year. Got rear-ended by someone going highway speed while I was stopped to turn left. Don't know how we both survived. Last month, another driver was in a wreck. Someone pulled in front of him. The other vehicle got T-boned. Killed the driver. Coworker turned in his stuff and quit the next day. He's never going to drive a truck again. Even though he wasn't at fault, he messed him up mentally. I gave him the number of the therapist I used after my wreck. I hope he takes it to heart. After my wreck, I was damn near ready to give up driving, period. Both semi and car. One of my first jobs in the trades, I was working on a hotel and timeshare expansion. I was part of the carpentry crew, and one of our responsibilities was cladding sections of the building with cedar shingles. One of the guys on the crew was an older guy, we'll call him Bob, who was pretty sketchy. He was just generally unsettled, nervous, and had a history of messed up injuries. Bob was shingling a section of chimney that you could only reach by a large stand of scaffolding. When doing corners with shingles, it requires making of square cuts to the shingles. He was cutting the shingles with a small cordless circular saw, and because of the off-square cut, the cutoff had a tendency to bind in the saw's guard. Bob got the bright idea to fix the guard fully open to stop the shingles from binding in the saw. I was working about 200 feet away and just heard someone scream. I wasn't positive I had actually heard someone screaming or just someone being loud, so I looked around at ground level but didn't see anyone. I was about to go back to work when I noticed Bob racing down the sections of scaffolding. I yelled, "Are you okay?" And he yelled, "No, get help." I then looked at his leg and I swore I saw bones sticking out of his leg through his jeans. I panicked, cause I was a kid, and ran to try to find our foreman. They grabbed first aid and someone else called 911. Got back over to him and it was bad. My eyes lied to me. What I thought was bone, was just the white fray from the denim that had been cut by the blade. What had happened, however, was he had ran the saw down the entire lower section of his leg. It was to the bone, but the bone was not broken. After a few minutes, he relaxed, had a cigarette, and waited from the ambulance. He ended up needing around 80 stitches. It was nasty. 2 weeks later I am working on the same job and someone taps me on my shoulder. I turn around and my coworker stick his slit wrist directly into my face. The wound was huge and I have no idea how he didn't hit an artery. He was working on a section of tin roof early in the morning. There was dew on the roof and he lost his footing as he was in the middle of cutting a shingle. Was making the cut with an Olfa knife and jammed it into his wrist. First commercial site. Great lessons in what not to do. Some other honorable mentions. I was doing concrete forming one summer and they had poured a column too high. Guy was chipping and smashing it back down to grade. When you work in forming you use giant framing hammers. 28 ounces is standard. Watched guy swing his framing hammer as hard as he could into his other thumb that was resting on the column. He exploded it into mush. During a cleanup at the end of the day, 2 workers were passing tools down from the second floor to ground level. Guy on second would drop tool to the guy down below. Watched guy on ground catch a pneumatic framing gun with his face. It was the heaviest gun we had on site. Knew an electrician whose thing was grabbing you and then lift wires. If you felt him touch you, you knew you were about to feel 120 volts. Not particularly dangerous but fairly annoying. Family business about melamine and wood furniture. My father has many scars and half of middle finger missing. One of our workers is missing various fingers. The worst I've seen, apart from various cuts that needed stitches, was one of our employees cleaning a melamine edge banding machine. Another employee then puts a melamine slab in the machines, pulls it and starts the process. One of the 2 blades, like 5 inches, but spins really fast like 12k RPM. Cuts the edge, banding goes up and cuts open his finger and blood starts dripping everywhere. The blade twisted the finger and cut in a spiral way. The finger was all messed up and you can see the bone. Somehow the doctors fixed the finger and it looks good today apart from the scar. Several years ago my father worked at the docks in Portland, Oregon, salvaging a defunct Navy barge. Everything on the ship was solid steel. One day, one of the guys he worked with was cutting down one of the larger walls but didn't make sure it had support, and when he cut through the last bit of it the wall fell over and crushed him flat. When they got it lifted up, there was nothing left of him but a large, wet, smear. This isn't my story, but my dad's. When I was a year old, 31 years ago, he worked at a huge factory that made those giant wire cables. He was working in one of the machine rooms, and a cabling machine which should not have been working in the first place activated while he had his arm inside of it. His entire arm was twisted into a letter S by the force of the machine, and he was stuck there hours. Amazingly didn't lose his arm, though he still has a scar the entire length of his forearm today. Worst thing is that it happened on Bonfire Night, a UK holiday on November 5th, so when he got to the hospital it was already packed with idiots who had gotten too close to the fireworks. And of course, being my dad, he let a little kid with bad burns jump ahead of him in line while he's sitting there with his arm literally shattered in 3 places. While I was working in a warehouse at a furniture factory, weekend shift during college, a friend of mine was driving a pallet jack that you stand on, towards me full speed, while I had my back to him doing my computer work in front of a solid steel desk. I loaded trucks bound for other plants. We would often jump off the jacks while they were still moving because when you let go of the lever thing that you controlled it with, it would spring up and kick the brakes on. The brakes never kicked on and I was hit full speed by these jacks that weigh thousands of pounds. It caught the back of my leg and I still believe the only reason it didn't snap my leg in half was because it hit me at an angle and my leg rolled with the hit. I got a nice gash that required a little less than a dozen staples. My leg looked like a tube of toothpaste had been squeezed in the middle. I never got a dime from workers' compensation, but I got to sit in the office area all day at work for a couple weeks while I healed to the point where walking wasn't extremely painful. About 10 years later and I still have clear indentions in my shin, just skin and bone. It feels wavy. Had a coworker panic and attempt to jump off a moving forklift because the controls jammed. She was headed towards an open dock. Unfortunately, when she stuck her leg out, she crushed her foot between a yellow safety pole and the lift. She ended up losing her leg from the knee down. Had another coworker at another job stick her finger in the conveyor belt by accident and it took the tip off her finger. As for me, my glove was caught in a torque machine and tore the tendons in my finger. My finger is permanently bent. My father is a forester. Some years ago, a branch fell from maybe 5 to 10 meters and pierced his hard hat, even though he had waited some 5 minutes just to be sure it was safe to go near the fallen tree. Anyway, his neck and spine did suffer some damage but he can still work. Also, branches do often get stuck on other tree branches when you fell them. Some branches can even grow into each other and can take an entire tree with it, which was also the reason one of my father's brothers died, under a tree. Before I started at my current workplace, someone there tried to get between a couple of train cars before they joined up and got his entire abdomen pinched in the couplers. Apparently they couldn't separate them without killing him instantly. Not entirely sure what took place after the incident, but of course he died soon after. Same place, an electrician tried to hop between beams instead of climbing down and back up, ended up slipping on some debris and fell 20 feet, which might have been survivable, had he not hit his head on the corner of a solid metal welding table, taking out a portion of his skull. Every industrial area I've worked insists on not calling 911 after an injury, and to call the minimum wage security guard who may or may not be at the desk to answer the phone. My personal belief as to the explanation of this is that the security guard can make sure the employee is declared dead off-site, so that it can be recorded as an injury and not a death on the premises. We are also not technically allowed to have cell phones or radios. Not a coworker but my husband. He worked in a cabinet shop at a university in Texas. He was told to use a machine that he was not trained on. The supervisor set it up with the safety guard disabled. A broomstick-sized piece of wood shot out and went through my husband's thigh, barely missing his fem artery. About 3 inches sticking out in the front and 2 inches sticking out the back. While he was in surgery, the legal people from the university arrived and had him sign a release form right after surgery while under morphine. That disqualified us from suing even though it was signed when he was not of sound mind. They fired him when he didn't heal fast enough to go back to full duty fast enough. A cautionary tale from my old company that I tell all new employees I train. A barmaid on shift went to change a keg, and was putting the coupling on whilst standing over the new barrel. This particular barrel had at some point been damaged or made with a fault, because as soon as she closed the coupling the gas pressure fired the bar that goes down through the middle of the keg out the top, and pinned her skull first to the ceiling in the cellar, killing her instantly. Don't stand over the barrel when changing it, stand slightly off to the side. I was working at a warehouse, HVAC stuff, and in one industrial 10 meters tall shelf there were pallets of toilet bowls stored, 6 in each pallet, not wrapped, and a dude accidentally dropped a pallet on the floor with his forklift. A very satisfying crash occurred, He then proceeded to lift one up back to the pallet so he could drive them to garbage. Unfortunately, he didn't see it was broken at the bottom where he grabbed it, and the extremely sharp porcelain edge sliced 2 of his fingers nearly off by the knuckles. They were only hanging on from a sliver or skin. I've witnessed several accidents and been in several myself. None of them are fun, but the one that sticks out in my mind was when the piece of equipment at a restaurant used for cleaning out the hot grease from a fryer so that the fryer could be cleaned inside, failed. And ended up sending 350° Fahrenheit shortening all over this guy's foot. His boot had to be cut off, as did part of his pants. And his foot degloved.